My name is Claire Donovan. I'm 30 years old, and just over a month ago, the ground beneath my feet shifted in a way I never saw coming. It started with a funeral and ended with my entire family looking at me like I was the enemy. One decision, one signature I refused to give, changed everything. Before I take you deeper into this story, which gets a whole lot messier than you might expect, I want to ask you something. What would you do if your entire family turned against you over money? Would you stand your ground, even if it meant standing alone? Let me know in the comments. And if stories like this, messy, emotional, painfully real, speak to something in you, consider subscribing. This isn't just about inheritance. It's about legacy, betrayal, and the unexpected strength you find when you've got no one left to lean on. It only gets more intense from here. It happened on a Tuesday. I was sitting in Mr. Halford's law office, a small paneled room filled with the smell of lemon polish and old books. He was my grandfather's longtime attorney, stoic, kind, and maddeningly calm. The moment he read the words, "To my granddaughter Claire Elizabeth Donovan, I leave the entirety of my estate," I felt something inside me crack open. My chest tightened. My heart raced. Across the room, my mother slowly took off her designer sunglasses. The silence stretched just long enough for me to know this wasn't over. It was just beginning. The estate wasn't just about money, it was his legacy. Leonard Donovan had built his life around books. Not just reading them, but building a business from them. One modest bookstore in a quiet Oregon town that grew into a beloved chain of 6 locations across the Pacific Northwest. He was known in the community as the Bookman, and to me, he was a lighthouse in a storm that never seemed to let up. My mother, Diana, didn't see it that way. To her, books were clutter. Legacy was a word people used when they didn't have real wealth. She'd never worked a day in the stores, never attended a family meeting, never lifted a box during inventory season. But somehow she believed she was entitled to it all, because she was his daughter and I was just me. The truth is, Grandpa had practically raised me. When my parents divorced, my mom unraveled. She jumped from job to job, boyfriend to boyfriend, city to city. I remember being 9 years old, sitting on a suitcase on the front porch, waiting for her to come back from a quick trip that turned into 3 days. Grandpa was the one who showed up. He always showed up. When I was 13, I started working Saturdays at the bookstore. At first, I thought I was just being babysat, but soon he started handing me real tasks, balancing the register, counting stock, watching customer flow. He'd lean over my shoulder, his voice warm but firm, and say, "Look for what's missing, not just what's there." He didn't just teach me how to run a store, he taught me how to read people. He once said, "Books are only half the business. The rest is trust. You lose that, you lose everything." That sentence stuck with me in ways I didn't fully understand until much later. When it came time for college, I told him I wanted to major in business. He smiled so wide, I thought his face might crack. "Smart girl," he said, "you've got the bones for it." He offered to pay my tuition outright, no strings attached. But when Diana caught wind of it, everything changed. Suddenly, she was calling him in tears, talking about Jerry's back surgery, Max's private school tuition, and Leela's emergency dental bills. Money that was meant for my future became shared family resources. That was always her favorite phrase when she was about to take something that wasn't hers. I took out loans, worked part-time at a bakery, lived with 3 roommates in a leaky apartment just off campus. Grandpa tried to help in small ways, slipping me envelopes with handwritten notes that said things like, "For books," or "chocolate," or "a getaway from the madness." Every time he said, "Don't tell your mother," I could hear the disappointment in his voice. Not in me, in her. When his health started declining, I began visiting more often. His voice grew softer, but his mind stayed sharp. One afternoon in the hospital, he reached for my hand and said, "Claire, promise me something. When the time comes, you'll hold your ground." I promised, even though I didn't fully understand what he meant. Not yet. He passed away in his sleep on a rainy Sunday morning. It felt cruel, the way the world just kept spinning, people buying coffee and walking dogs, while I sat in my car outside the hospital, unable to breathe. I knew grief would come. What I didn't know was that betrayal would follow right behind it. 2 weeks later, I walked into that law office expecting tears, maybe some arguing. But I wasn't prepared for silence. Cold, calculated silence from my mother as the will was read. She didn't interrupt at first. She waited until the final line landed in the room like a thunderclap. Then she leaned forward and said, "That's a mistake. He wouldn't do that." He couldn't, but he did. And I think a part of her knew it. She just never thought she'd lose. Outside, in the parking lot, she approached me with that terrifying calm she only uses when she's about to manipulate someone. "Just sign it over, Claire," she said. "This is a family matter. You don't want to be the reason we fall apart." I didn't respond, not right away. I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized something I hadn't admitted to myself until that moment. She didn't want what was best for the family. She wanted control, always had, and I had just become the one thing she couldn't control. That's when I knew this wasn't just about a bookstore or a house or a portfolio of stocks. It was about values, the ones he built his life around and the ones I'd now have to fight to protect. This was the first battle, and it was far from over. I didn't sleep that night. After the will reading and that tense parking lot confrontation, I went home and sat in silence for hours. My phone buzzed constantly, texts from cousins I hadn't heard from in years, a missed call from my aunt who just wanted to check in. And then, finally, a single message from my mother. "We need to talk tomorrow, 6 p.m. at the house, everyone will be there. Not would you come, not can we talk." Just a command, like I was a soldier being summoned to headquarters. For a few minutes, I stared at the message and considered ignoring it. I knew what it was, not a conversation, but a setup. But some stubborn part of me, probably the same part Grandpa spent years sharpening, told me I had to face them. If I didn't, this would keep growing in the shadows, and I wasn't going to let his legacy be swallowed by whispers and backroom plots. So the next evening, I pulled up to the house I grew up in. Everything looked exactly the same: white shutters, overgrown hedges, that crack in the driveway Dad never fixed before he left. But it didn't feel like home. Not anymore. When I walked through the front door, I was hit with the smell of perfume and tension. My mother was already seated at the dining table, flanked by Jerry on one side and Leela on the other. Max sat on the arm of the couch, bouncing his knee restlessly. No one smiled. "Claire," my mother said, her tone polished but icy, "we're so glad you came." She gestured to the table like it was some kind of welcoming banquet. But all I saw was an ambush in the shape of a family dinner. "I'm here to listen," I said carefully, staying near the entryway. "But I won't be pressured into anything." "Of course not," she said, her mouth curling at the corners. "This is just a discussion, a civil one." I didn't believe her for a second. For the next 20 minutes, my family took turns telling me why Grandpa's decision was unfair. Jerry started with a gentle, rehearsed tone. "Claire, managing an estate of that size, it's overwhelming. It's not a one-person job. Your mom has more experience with this kind of thing. We could help you, make it easier." Leela chimed in next, tearfully recounting how Grandpa had promised to help her with student loans. Something I didn't doubt, but also something that didn't justify rewriting a will. And then Max, quiet for most of it, finally spoke. "I don't even want the money," he said, "but you know this isn't what he would have wanted. He loved all of us." That line, that's the one they all kept using. He loved all of us. As if love had to be proven with dollar signs, I let them talk. I let them spin their web of nostalgia and guilt and family unity. I nodded when it was appropriate. I even sipped the lukewarm tea my mother had placed in front of me. But when she finally leaned in, clasped her hands, and said, "So, all we're asking is for you to sign a few papers to make sure things are distributed more fairly." I drew a slow, steady breath and said, "No." The word dropped like a brick. My mother's jaw tightened. "Excuse me." "I said no," I repeated, this time louder. "Grandpa made his decision. He trusted me. I'm not going to betray that trust just to avoid an uncomfortable dinner." "Uncomfortable?" she snapped. "Claire, this is your family." "And he was my family too," I shot back. more than any of you ever were." Her face went pale, then red. Jerry put a hand on her arm, but she shook it off. "You're being selfish," she hissed. "You think you earned any of this? You were his little pet project. You don't know what real responsibility looks like." "Maybe not," I said quietly, "but I know manipulation when I see it." I stood, pushed in my chair, and turned to leave. Behind me, voices rose, Jerry demanding I reconsider, Leela crying, Max saying something about just giving us a piece. But I didn't look back, because I knew if I did, I might hesitate. And that's exactly what they were counting on. That night, the campaign began. It started with a message from my mother: "You have no idea what you're doing. You're hurting everyone." Then came the calls, dozens of them. From aunts, cousins, even my old piano teacher, who told me she'd always thought I was better than this. As if choosing to respect a legal will made me a villain. When I stopped responding, the social media posts began. Vague but pointed. Photos of old family gatherings with captions like, "Some people forget where they came from." Leela posted a black and white photo of Grandpa with the quote, "He loved us all equally. Remember that." It was exhausting. Every notification felt like a jab, every status update a scar. And yet, I didn't bend. Because even though it hurt, and God, it hurt, I knew I had to be the one to break the pattern. A few days later, something even more unexpected happened. Max showed up at my apartment. He stood in the doorway, looking younger than his 19 years, hands shoved deep into his hoodie pockets. "I'm not here to fight," he said. "I just needed to talk to someone who's not losing their mind." I let him in, made him tea, sat across from him on the couch while he stared at the floor. "Mom's not okay," he said finally. "I mean, she's never been totally okay, but this, she's spiraling." "I know," I said softly. "She keeps saying we'll fix it, that she's working on a plan. I don't know what that means, but it sounds bad." I nodded. "I'm sorry you're caught in this," I told him, and I meant it. Because even though he'd sat silently at that dinner table, even though he hadn't defended me, I knew what it was like to grow up trying to survive Diana Donovan. Before he left, he looked at me and said, "I don't care about the money, I really don't, but I think she does, and she's not gonna let it go." I believed him, and I knew then that this wasn't just going to be a war of words or guilt. It was going to escalate, and I had to be ready. That night, I called someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Eli Matthews, an old friend of Grandpa's and a retired estate lawyer who once mentored me during a college internship. When I told him what was happening, he didn't sound surprised. "Your grandfather was a smart man," Eli said, "and he always said your mother had more ambition than ethics." "Do I need a lawyer?" I asked. "Yes," he replied without hesitation. "Not because you've done anything wrong, but because people who want something they can't have often do dangerous things to get it." He offered to connect me with someone. A friend of his, a woman named Rachel Keene, who specialized in inheritance disputes. I took the number, thanked him, and tried not to cry, not because I was scared, but because I realized for the first time in weeks, I wasn't alone. I had no idea then just how far my mother was willing to go, or how prepared I'd need to be to stop her. But something inside me had shifted. I wasn't the same girl who stayed quiet to keep the peace. I was the executor of a legacy, and I was finally ready to protect it. A week after the family meeting, just when I thought things might finally settle, I received another message from my mother. It was simple, short, calculated. "Dinner at the house, just us. Let's talk this through. 7 p.m. There was no apology, no explanation, just a time and a place. That was how Diana operated. She never asked. She summoned. I stared at the message for a while, debating whether I should go. Part of me wanted to delete it and move on with my life. But a bigger part, the one Grandpa had spent years nurturing, knew better. Avoidance never solves anything. And I had a gnawing feeling this wasn't just a dinner. This was a performance, and I was expected to play my part. So I replied with a single word: "Okay." I arrived at the house 10 minutes early. The driveway was empty except for my mother's luxury SUV. The porch light was on, casting a glow over the front steps. Everything looked oddly peaceful, like the calm before a storm. She greeted me at the door with that well-practiced smile she used for church events and community fundraisers. Her makeup was perfect. Her tone was sugar-sweet. "Claire, come in. I made your favorite lemon chicken with rosemary." I didn't trust the smile or the menu. Inside, the dining table was set with real china. Candles flickered gently. It was staged, all of it. Every fork and napkin folded with intent. My mother never did this unless she was trying to control the narrative. I sat down across from her and waited. She poured wine into crystal glasses and launched into small talk. How the weather had been unusually mild. How the neighborhood was changing. How Leela might be applying to grad school. I nodded where appropriate, but my hands stayed in my lap. I didn't touch the wine. Finally, she leaned forward and rested her elbows on the table. "Claire," she began, her voice soft, "your grandfather built something incredible. But you and I both know he wasn't thinking clearly when he made those decisions." I met her eyes. "He was of sound mind, Mom. You heard the lawyer. He was sick. He was tired. He trusted you, yes, but he didn't realize how that would impact the rest of us." Her tone shifted slightly, becoming firmer. "This isn't how families survive. We're supposed to take care of each other." I could feel the trap tightening. "Then why did he leave it all to me?" I asked. "If he truly believed in sharing, why did he name only me?" Her face darkened for a second, then she recovered. "Because you manipulated him. You visited him alone. You planted ideas, you took advantage." I didn't respond immediately. I just watched her, noting the flicker of frustration in her expression when I didn't rise to the bait. "Mom, I never asked him for a dime. He offered, he planned. You know he was meticulous. He didn't make mistakes with numbers or people." She set her wine glass down a little too hard. "Be honest, don't you think this has gotten out of control? The lawyers, the tension, the posts on Facebook. Is this really what you want?" "No," I said, "but I'm not the one who started it." Her smile returned, thinner now, strained. "Let's fix it then. You can sign over the business accounts to me. We'll keep you on as an advisor or something. I'll even give you a monthly stipend if that makes it easier." The way she said it, like she was offering me a favor, nearly made me laugh. "I'm not signing anything," I said calmly. Her eyes narrowed. "So that's it. You're going to hoard everything while your family struggles." "You had the money," I said. "You had years of support from Grandpa. I saw the wire transfers, the checks, the cars. You didn't struggle. You just never learned how to stop spending." That cracked her composure. The mask slipped, and for a moment, I saw the woman underneath, the one who had blamed everyone but herself her entire life. "This isn't over," she said through clenched teeth. I pushed back from the table. "It never is with you." As I walked toward the door, she called after me, her voice sharp. "You think this is about money? It's about loyalty, about family. You don't just walk away from your own blood." I paused with my hand on the doorknob. "Maybe not," I said without turning around. "But sometimes you have to walk away from people who keep bleeding you dry." I closed the door behind me and stepped into the night air, heart pounding, adrenaline rushing through my veins. It hadn't been a dinner. It had been a declaration of war. The next morning, I found out just how far she was willing to take it. My supervisor at work, Erin, called me into her office. "Claire, I don't want to overstep, but is everything okay at home?" I blinked, confused. "Yes." "Why?" "Your mother's called here, twice. Once asking to speak to HR and once trying to reach you directly. She said it was urgent." My stomach dropped, Erin sighed. "I didn't put her through, obviously, but I'm letting you know. If it continues, we'll need to make a formal report." I apologized profusely, my face burning. She waved it off, kind as always, but the damage was done. Diana had crossed. Rachel Keene's office sat on the second floor of an old red brick building downtown. No fancy logo, no glass walls, just a small bronze plaque beside the door that read, "Keene and Fellows, Family Law and Estate Protection." It wasn't what I expected, and that instantly made me feel more at ease. She greeted me with a firm handshake and eyes that had clearly seen too much nonsense to be fooled easily. Her hair was in a loose bun, her blazer sharp but unpretentious, and her office smelled faintly of peppermint tea and printer paper. The kind of space where truth mattered more than theatrics. I sat down on the leather chair opposite her desk and handed her the file I'd put together: copies of the will, text messages from my mother, social media posts, and the typed summary of everything that had happened since Grandpa's passing. She flipped through the first few pages in silence. Then she looked up. "You've done more preparation than half the clients I've had in 10 years, she said. I smiled, a little embarrassed. Grandpa taught me to document everything. Rachel nodded approvingly. "Smart man, now let's talk about your options." She laid them out clearly, efficiently. My mother couldn't legally challenge the will on grounds of unfairness. That wasn't how inheritance law worked. But she could file a claim of undue influence, alleging that I manipulated Grandpa while he was sick and coerced him into changing his will. "She'll have to prove he was mentally compromised or that you used pressure or deception," Rachel explained. "Based on what I see here, she doesn't have much." "That won't stop her from trying," I said. "No," she agreed, "but we're going to make sure she regrets it if she does." The next few days blurred into a flurry of activity. Rachel helped me draft a cease and desist letter for my mother's harassment and advised me to begin recording any phone conversations. Legal in our state, thankfully. She recommended I document every encounter going forward, no matter how small. "She's creating a narrative," Rachel said, "and we're going to dismantle it piece by piece." I installed cameras at my apartment, changed my email passwords, updated my HR file at work to prevent unauthorized calls. Every step I took made me feel a little more in control, but also a little more hollow. Like I was shedding pieces of my normal life, one layer at a time. The pressure was constant, unspoken, heavy. My phone remained a source of dread. Every ping made my heart skip. Every voicemail felt like a trap. I started waking up in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, panicked that I'd missed something. Some message, some deadline, some new strategy from her side that would undo everything I'd worked to protect. One night, I found myself crying on the floor of my kitchen at 2 a.m., clutching my phone like it was a lifeline. I didn't want to call anyone, but I didn't want to be alone either. I ended up texting Ethan. He arrived 20 minutes later, barefoot and half asleep, wrapping me in his arms without a word. "I'm losing my mind," I whispered. "No," he said softly. "You're fighting a war no one sees, and you're still standing." That's when I realized this wasn't just about protecting Grandpa's estate anymore. It was about protecting myself. Rachel called a few days later with a suggestion. "If there's anyone who can corroborate your grandfather's intentions, especially near the end, I want to talk to them." I hesitated, then remembered George. George Fulton had been Grandpa's best friend since college. They played chess every Saturday at the park and had lunch at the same diner every Wednesday. If anyone knew what Grandpa was thinking during those final months, it was George. I gave him a call and asked if we could meet. He didn't hesitate. "Claire," he said, voice gravelly but warm, "I've been waiting for this." We met at the diner the next morning. He looked older than I remembered, his cane leaning against the booth and his thick gray eyebrows arched as he studied me. "You look tired," he said. I nodded. "I am." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small white envelope. "Your grandfather gave me this 3 months before he passed. Said if things got messy, and they probably would, I should give it to you." I took the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a handwritten letter on cream stationery, dated shortly after his diagnosis. In it, Grandpa explained his decision in full. How he had supported Diana financially for years. How he watched her take and take without ever building anything. How he had hoped she'd change, but finally had to accept that she never would. He wrote about me, how I reminded him of his younger self, how I showed discipline, how I respected what he had built. His final line read, "Claire, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and the storm has begun. Stand your ground. This isn't just money, it's value, and you're the only one I trust to carry it forward." I blinked away tears and handed it to Rachel later that afternoon. "This," she said, holding the letter carefully, "is gold." But just when I thought I had regained the upper hand, the next blow came hard and personal. It was a Friday night when I returned home from work and saw her car parked across the street. My mother, S. I froze for a moment, wondering if I was imagining it, but then the headlights flashed once. A signal. She had been waiting. I didn't approach. I went inside, locked the door, and called Rachel. "She's escalating," I said, pacing the hallway. "Stay inside," Rachel instructed. "I'm filing for a temporary protection order on Monday." "But I haven't been threatened." "That doesn't matter. She's showing up uninvited. We document it, we take it seriously." For the first time since this started, I felt fear crawl beneath my skin in a way I couldn't shake. The next morning, my neighbor texted me a photo. Diana had been parked there for over an hour, engine running. I stared at the image for a long time. She was watching, waiting, planning, and I had no idea what would come next. That weekend, Rachel and I built a full archive. Texts, voicemails, emails, photos, legal filings, the letter from George, every shred of proof that what Grandpa had done was not the result of manipulation, but a final act of clarity. "He knew," I said. "He saw this coming." Rachel nodded. "That's why he gave you the tools." But the hardest part wasn't the legal battle. It was the emotional one. Because every move I made to protect myself, every form, every statement, every locked door, put another crack in the idea that I still had a family. I didn't know what was left anymore. But I knew this: if they were going to come for me, for the will, for the business, they'd have to get through me first. And I wasn't the scared little girl anymore. I was Leonard Donovan's granddaughter. And I had everything to protect. The message came on a Tuesday afternoon, buried between a work email and a shipping notification from an online bookstore I barely remembered ordering from. It was from my mother, short as always. "Family meeting, Friday, 4 p.m. Be on time." No please. No explanation. Just a command like always. For a few seconds, I stared at the screen, my cursor hovering over the message as if holding my gaze would make it disappear. But I knew better. This wasn't just a meeting. It was a setup. I could feel it in my chest, a slow, low pressure like the first pull of a riptide. I forwarded the message to Rachel with a simple note: "Here we go." She replied almost instantly, "Don't go alone." I agreed, in principle, but in my gut I knew I had to. I couldn't bring Ethan, couldn't bring a lawyer, couldn't hide. If I walked in with backup, they'd twist it, say I was escalating, say I wasn't family anymore. They were already painting me as a villain. I wouldn't give them more to use. Rachel understood, reluctantly. "Then we planned for the worst," she said. "We went over everything again, the documents I'd carry. The letter from Grandpa, George's statement, the timeline of harassment. I saved audio backups to 2 cloud accounts, printed hard copies of every key file, and kept one folder in the trunk of my car, just in case. The night before the meeting, I barely slept. I kept picturing every version of what might happen. Would they cry, scream, try to hug me like nothing was wrong? I didn't know which would be worse. By morning, I felt hollow. Like I had poured all of myself into preparation and had nothing left for fear. I dressed in navy slacks and a gray blouse, neutral colors, businesslike, not flashy, not aggressive, just firm. I arrived at the house a few minutes before 4. The driveway was full: Jerry's truck, Leela's compact, and 2 unfamiliar cars I didn't recognize. That detail struck me. Grandpa's rules were always family only. So why the extra vehicles? I parked on the street, took a steadying breath, and grabbed my leather portfolio from the passenger seat. Inside was everything: the will, the letter, the proof. When I walked up to the door, it opened before I could knock. Diana stood in the doorway, smiling, not a warm smile, a performance. "Claire," she said sweetly, stepping aside. Right on time. The house was quiet, too quiet. The living room had been rearranged slightly. Chairs were pulled into a semicircle. Leela and Max sat on the couch, their faces unreadable. Jerry stood near the fireplace, arms crossed. But what stopped me cold were the 2 men seated in the armchairs, the ones usually reserved for Grandpa and George. Both were middle-aged, well-dressed, and unfamiliar. My mother motioned toward them like she was presenting a prize. "This is Mr. Wallace and Mr. Darnell. They're here to help us sort through this unfortunate situation." I gave them a brief nod but didn't shake hands. I wasn't told there, DB legal counsel present, I said evenly. Oh, they're not lawyers, my mother said quickly, voice syrupy. Just advisors, helping with the paperwork. The word paperwork settled heavily in the room like smoke. I took the only empty seat, a hard wooden chair positioned directly opposite all of them. It was an interrogation setup if I'd ever seen one. Mr. Wallace leaned forward first, hands clasped politely. Claire, we understand this has been a stressful time for your family. Managing an estate of this size at your age can be quite the burden. I tilted my head. I've been in business development for 6 years. I can manage a balance sheet. He chuckled awkwardly. Of course, no one's questioning your capability. We're simply trying to find a solution that honors everyone's place in the family. And what would that solution look like? I asked, already knowing. Mr. Darnell opened a sleek black folder and slid a document across the coffee table toward me. A voluntary redistribution, he said smoothly. You would transfer primary assets, such as the bookstore holdings and investment accounts, to your mother, who has more life experience, while retaining a share for yourself. A generous share, we believe, 20%. Generous, I echoed, eyebrows raised. Leela chimed in then, voice shaking ever so slightly. You know Grandpa loved us all. He wasn't thinking clearly at the end. The medications, the pain. He was lucid, I interrupted. The will was updated 8 months before he passed. My mother's smile faltered, then returned, colder this time. No one wants a court battle, Claire, she said. It wouldn't reflect well on anyone, least of all your grandfather. Mr. Wallace added, if necessary, we have grounds to challenge. Undue influence. Time spent alone with the deceased during vulnerable months. He trailed off, letting the implications settle like fog. I looked at them all, the faces I grew up with, the people I used to call home, and I felt nothing but resolve. They weren't here to talk, they were here to take. I opened my folder and calmly laid out the letter from Grandpa. I'm not signing anything today, I said. And if you attempt to move forward with a legal challenge, I'll file for damages and harassment. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Jerry stepped forward, voice rising. You think you're better than us. You think one letter from a dying man makes you untouchable. Leela's eyes darted away. Max stared at the floor. Diana's voice cut through the room like ice. You've always been the favorite. Always manipulating. Always playing the victim. But this time, you don't win. I stood slowly. I didn't win anything, I said. I was chosen, because he knew exactly who each of us really was. And with that, I turned and walked toward the door. Behind me, someone shouted, but I didn't flinch, because I knew. This was only the beginning of what they were planning. And next time, they wouldn't just try to guilt me. They'd try to break me. By the time I got back to my car, my hands were trembling. Not from fear, not anymore. It was fury. A quiet, steady, white-hot rage that hummed in my bones. The kind that doesn't come from being surprised, but from expecting betrayal and watching it happen anyway. The kind that comes when people you once trusted look you in the eye and lie to your face with polished smiles and legal folders. I sat behind the wheel for a long time, gripping the steering wheel with both hands. My reflection in the rearview mirror didn't look like me. My cheeks were flushed, eyes too bright, lips pressed into a hard line. I didn't cry. I wouldn't give them that. Instead, I pulled out my phone and opened my messages. Claire, how did it go? Rachel had texted 30 minutes earlier. I replied with 2 words they ambushed. Then I sent the photo I had snapped of the advisors as they tried to slide that document across the table. And I hit call. Rachel answered on the first ring. Tell me everything. I did, every word, every accusation, every threat wrapped in velvet politeness. The manipulation, the leverage, the performative concern for Grandpa's memory while they tried to dismantle everything he built. Rachel didn't interrupt, but I could hear the change in her breath. She was angry too. That document they gave you, she said, was it notarized? Did they present themselves as legal representatives? They didn't use the word lawyer, I replied. But the setup was designed to intimidate me into signing. They called it a redistribution. They even mentioned court and undue influence. She was silent for a beat, then her voice sharpened. This isn't just pressure. This is coordinated coercion, and possibly fraud. We're going on the offensive. I lean my head back against the seat, heart still pounding. How? You're going to give them a taste of what they didn't expect. Documentation, proof, and public exposure if necessary. But more importantly, she said, her tone softening just a little, you're going to show them you're not alone in this. I feel alone, I admitted. I know, she said, but you're not. That night, I opened Grandpa's journal. I hadn't touched it since he passed. It was bound in brown leather, corners worn, pages thick with age and use. It still smelled like his study, cedar and ink and old dust. He had always been a meticulous note-taker. That much I knew, but as I flipped through the entries, I felt my throat tighten. Every loan he gave my mother was recorded. Every promise she made to repay him broken. Every manipulation, every excuse. Loaned Diana $7,500 for Max's braces. Later discovered funds were used for a spa weekend. She claims Leela needs emergency surgery. Asked for $15,000. Caught wind that she booked a cruise instead. Gave $20,000 for property taxes. Used to pay off Jerry's gambling debts. Again. The entries spanned years, but in the final months they became sharper, more deliberate, less disappointed and more resolved. Arrangements are in place. Claire is strong. She sees truth. She values what matters. If I fail Diana, I pray I don't fail Claire too. I couldn't hold back the tears this time. They came in slow waves, relief, grief, rage all woven together. This wasn't just evidence. It was Grandpa's voice, reaching through time, saying, "You were never crazy. You were never wrong. I saw everything." And I made this choice with my eyes open. The final entry was dated just 2 weeks before he passed. This will be the last time. I gave Diana $10,000 today for Max's college deposit. I doubt he'll see a dime of it. I'm tired, but not confused, I'm clear. Claire will carry this forward. She is who I always hoped Diana would become. I took photos of every entry, sent them to Rachel. Then I sat in the middle of my apartment, clutching that journal like it was the only thing anchoring me to reality. Because in that moment, it was. The next day, Rachel and I put together a full report. We created a secure digital folder with time-stamped images, transcriptions, scanned documents, and a sworn statement from George. The letter Grandpa had written to me was notarized. The journal excerpts were documented. We had a plan, we were ready. Then I received the next message. Bring your ID and bank documents. We'll finalize things today. See you at 4. There was no greeting, no punctuation. Just another attempt to sound casual, routine. I sat down in the only empty chair, once again placed deliberately in the center of the room like a defendant at trial. But this time, I didn't fold my hands in my lap. I placed the leather folder directly in front of me, spine aligned with the edge of the table, and met every single pair of eyes with quiet steel. My mother was the first to speak, her voice soft and sugar-laced. "Claire, thank you for coming. We really hope today we can resolve things, once and for all." I didn't answer. I wanted her to feel the silence. Wanted them all to understand that I was not the same woman who had sat in this house a week ago, trying to reason with people who had already decided who I was. Mr. Wallace leaned forward, once again playing the part of polite middleman. "We've gone ahead and updated the transfer paperwork based on our last discussion. Nothing complicated, just a reallocation of assets to reflect the shared nature of your grandfather's legacy." He slid a thick document toward me, the pen already placed carefully beside it. They weren't here to talk. They were here to seal the trap. My mother's smile twitched. Her eyes flashed just briefly toward the document, then back at me. "Once it's signed, we can all move forward, as a family." I reached into my folder without a word. I pulled out the first sheet, a printed photo of my mother's recent luxury cruise, the one she took the same week she told me she couldn't afford utilities. Then I placed a journal entry beside it. "March 9, I read aloud. Requested $12,000 for Max's emergency dental surgery. Funds used for spa resort and cruise. Documented by Leonard Donovan in his private records." Her smile vanished. I pulled out the next document. June 15, claimed property tax emergency. $18,000 transferred. Funds applied toward Jerry's poker debt. Leela let out a soft gasp. Mr. Wallace shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Mr. Darnell cleared his throat but said nothing. I laid out 5 more pages. Photos, dates, transfers, lies. I have copies of every page of the journal, I said calmly. All time-stamped, verified, all supported by George Fulton, who was granted secondary access to Leonard Donovan's financial planning before he passed. I opened the letter from Grandpa, the one he had written to me directly, the one that still carried the faintest smell of his study. I handed it to Mr. Wallace. I suggest you read that before continuing to advise my mother to pursue legal action. It makes his intentions clear. My mother stood abruptly, hands clenched. This is a smear campaign, she said. You're trying to make me look like some villain when all I've done is protect this family. I turned to her, voice steady. You weren't protecting anyone. You were draining him, year after year, and now you want to drain what's left. Her voice rose, trembled with fury. You ungrateful little girl, after everything I've sacrificed for you. Sacrificed? I said louder now. You used my college fund for a retreat in Sedona. Grandpa covered it without telling me, because he didn't want to ruin my belief in you. Leela's eyes darted toward Jerry, who looked down at the floor. And now you're threatening legal action based on a lie. My mother's eyes were wild now. You've always acted like you're better than us. You think being the favorite makes you right. No, I said, my voice shaking slightly, but clear. I think being trusted comes with responsibility. And I will not sign this business, this home, or this legacy over to someone who treats it like a credit card. Silence followed, thick, suffocating, then a voice broke through it. Max, I'm done, he said quietly. Everyone turned. He stood slowly, hands trembling, but his jaw set. I'm done pretending like I didn't see what was happening. I used to think Claire was the one being cold, distant, selfish. But now I see. He looked at our mother. You lied. To all of us, you used Grandpa. You made me believe she was the enemy. My mother shook her head, voice catching. Max, honey. No, he said. Don't, you lied about the money. You lied about the house in Arizona. You told me there was nothing left, and I believed you. His voice cracked. I thought you cared about my future, but you just wanted control. He turned to me. I'm sorry, Claire. I blinked, stunned. This wasn't part of the plan. I didn't know, not really, but I see it now, and I want out of it. He crossed the room and stood beside me. Not behind. Beside. For the first time in years, I felt the burn of tears behind my eyes, not from grief or rage or betrayal, but from something that felt dangerously close to hope. Jerry started to move forward, face red. You don't walk out on your family. I raised my phone. This conversation is being recorded, I said. Any attempt to intimidate me or my brother will be submitted to the court along with the rest of the file. That stopped him. Mr. Wallace rose, gathering his papers. Mr. Darnell followed suit. I believe our involvement here is concluded, Wallace said briskly. No one told us there was an attorney already retained. My mother stood frozen, her hands clenched at her sides. She didn't speak, not to them, not to me, not to Max. Just stood there, her empire collapsing around her in the quiet of a living room she once ruled like a throne. I turned to my brother. Let's go. And we did. We walked out into the evening light, side by side. Behind us, the door slammed shut with a sharp, hollow sound that echoed far too long. But we didn't look back. We were done looking back. And for the first time in weeks, I could breathe. I wasn't alone. The drive back to my apartment was quiet. Max didn't say much. Neither did I, but this time, the silence between us wasn't cold or awkward. It was full. Heavy with realization, with relief, and something that hadn't existed between us for a long time. Trust. When we stepped inside, I handed him a pillow and a folded blanket. He glanced at the pull-out couch and gave me a half-smile. It's not glamorous, I said, but it's yours if you want it. He nodded slowly. I do. There was no need to say more. That night, we didn't talk about what had happened at the house, or the way Mom's voice cracked when she realized she had lost her grip on us. We didn't talk about the years of resentment or the things we should have said sooner. Instead, He fell asleep almost instantly, like someone who had finally laid down a burden he didn't even know he was carrying. I sat on the floor nearby, knees pulled to my chest, arms wrapped tight. The quiet in the apartment was unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. For the first time in weeks, it wasn't threatening. It was calm. And in that calm, I began to understand something. Maybe Grandpa hadn't just left me a business or a house or a portfolio. Maybe what he really left me was a compass, and I was only just now learning how to use it. In the days that followed, things shifted. The phone calls stopped. The cryptic Facebook posts from my mother slowed to a trickle. No more vague accusations, no more guilt-laced voicemails. The silence should have unsettled me, but it didn't. It felt earned, like a ceasefire in a war that had drained everyone. Max stayed. He woke up early, helped me sort through Grandpa's paperwork. We worked side by side cleaning out the study, a room that still smelled faintly like old coffee and dust and cedar. We opened boxes I hadn't touched since I was a kid. Ledgers, invoices, yellowed receipts held together with rusted paper clips. There were hand-drawn plans for a new layout of the original store, scribbled notes about a potential expansion. Even a napkin sketch of a bookmobile idea Grandpa had once mentioned over dinner when I was too young to understand what it meant. One morning, Max pulled out a faded photo of Grandpa standing in front of the very first storefront. His sleeves were rolled up, his hair slicked back with sweat, and the smile on his face looked like it had been carved into stone, unshakable. He told me once that bookstores were more about people than books, Max said, turning the photo over. That stories bring people in, but community is what makes them stay. I didn't say anything right away. Instead, I took the photo gently from his hand, tracing the outline of Grandpa's silhouette with my thumb. I remembered him telling me something similar when I was 13, sitting behind the counter at the downtown branch. I had asked him why he always remembered customers' names, even the ones who only came in once. He'd smiled and said, "Because someday they'll come in again, and when they do, they'll remember that I remembered." That was the kind of legacy he left. Not just shelves of books or real estate, but care, memory, intention. I turned to Max. "You still planning to start business school next year?" He nodded, "If I get in." "You will," I said, then paused. "Would you want to intern at the store in the meantime? Help me manage the next phase?" His eyes widened, not with ego but with something gentler. "Belief. Are you serious?" "Completely," I said. "You've already proven you see things others don't. That's half the battle." "What's the other half?" "Not giving up when it gets hard." He laughed. "That one might take a little more work." "I'll teach you," I said, "like Grandpa taught me." We started slow. Rachel helped us formalize Max's internship. We went over business records together, reviewed vendor contracts, mapped out a quarterly growth plan, and began thinking about what the store could become in a new era. Max suggested starting a weekend workshop series for young readers. I proposed partnering with a local school district to supply free reading materials. Little things at first, but meaningful. The more we worked, the more I saw in him. Not just potential, but heart. The kind of heart Grandpa had quietly fostered in me for years. A few weeks into the new routine, I received a message I hadn't expected. It was from Leela. "I know I have no right to ask this, but would you be willing to meet? Just talk." I stared at the screen for a long time, unsure how to feel. I had expected her to vanish behind our mother's anger, to never reach out again. But something in the tone of the message felt different. Less like an ambush, more like a white flag. We met at a cafe halfway between her place and the store. She arrived early, which surprised me. Her makeup was subtle, her posture more uncertain than I remembered. She sat quietly, fiddling with the corner of a napkin until I sat across from her. "I'm not here to ask for money," she said before I could even speak. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry." I waited, letting her fill the space. I believed Mom, all of it. I was angry and scared, and truthfully, I was jealous. "You were always closer to Grandpa, but I see now that it wasn't favoritism. It was trust, and I didn't earn it." Her voice cracked slightly. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just wanted you to know that I'm not on her side anymore." I nodded, slowly, carefully. I appreciate you saying that. She looked up, surprised. You do. I do, and for what it's worth, I've missed you too. We didn't resolve everything over that one cup of coffee. There were still wounds, still landmines we hadn't stepped on yet. But it was a start. A quiet one, a fragile one, but real. That night, as Max and I sat on the porch watching the last light fade over the trees Grandpa had planted decades ago, he leaned back and sighed. You think he'd be proud. I looked out at the horizon, the colors shifting from gold to violet in soft streaks across the sky. I think he'd tell us to keep going, I said, to make it matter. We sat in silence again, but this time it was warm, peaceful. We weren't just fixing what was broken anymore. We were building something new. And for the first time, the future didn't feel like a fight. It felt like a choice. 6 months after everything, the store was alive again. Max had grown into his role beside me, and I no longer